I'm very happy to welcome back once again Professor Richard Wolff. And for those of you who may not recall from his last appearance, Professor Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm losing my headset. And currently visiting professor at the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University in New York. He's also the host of the program Economic Update, which is on Free Speech Tuesdays from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern, and he is the founder of democracyatwork.info, which I strongly recommend you check out. I've been relying on it for years. And without further ado, Richard Wolff, thanks for coming back on the program.
Well, thank you, Richard. I'm glad to be here.
So before we get started, I wanted to play an audio clip. And the reason why I wanted to play this audio clip to frame our discussion is you're known to be familiar with the works of Marx. We've talked about Marx on the program. This audio clip is, in fact, a clip of Marx, that is to say, Groucho Marx. It's from one of the old Marx Brothers films, Coconuts, which, if you're a Marx Brothers aficionado, may not have been their best work. But I wanted to play it because, well, I'll explain why in a second, but just to set up the clip for the audience, you don't really need the visual. The audio will be fine, although our viewers will see it. But the situation is Groucho is once again a kind of, shifty character, always trying to do a deal, and he's running a hotel. And the bellmen, who in those days were called bellboys, are up in arms because they haven't been paid for some time. So Groucho gives a little talk to placate them. I will also, it's a short clip. I will also tell the audience that Groucho makes reference to two popular weekly magazines of the time that no longer exist, Liberty and Collier's. So with that in mind, I want to start out. Let's hear from Marx himself.
We want our wages.
Wages? You want to be wage slaves? Answer me that.
No.
No, of course not. Well, what makes wage slaves? Wages. I want you to be free. Remember, there's nothing like liberty, except Collier's and the Saturday Evening Post. Be free, my friends, one for all and all for me, and me for you, and 3 for 5, and 6 for a quarter.
So, well, okay, like I say, it's not their best material humor-wise, but the reason why I wanted to play it was because it struck me, it popped into my head, I'd seen it many years ago, but it struck me that the whole premise of this routine, of the joke, is that for the audience to get it, they had to be familiar with the rhetoric of wage slavery, that the audiences of 1929 or so were assumed by film producers to understand that there was an argument that said people who do not govern their own economic affairs at work, people who are paid wages, are slaves. That concept, I think it was a longstanding socialist concept. You could correct me if I'm wrong. But in some ways, it seems to me it was part of the political discourse nearly 100 years ago. In a way, it isn't anymore. And so, Richard Wolff, I wanted to get your thoughts. And first of all, am I right about my assumptions about this clip? And secondly, why you think the discourse shifted over the last 90 years or so?
Yeah, I think basically you are right. I would only expand it a little bit to say that Marx himself, the original one, Karl, not Groucho, used the phrase from time to time for a very obvious reason. He wanted to connect in people's minds the notion of a wage earner, a human being who does labor in exchange for being paid a wage, with slavery. I mean, that was a rhetorical device designed to give people the very idea you're talking about, and that was quite successful. Marx was not the only person, of course, who made the connection, and it became a fairly commonsensical idea based on a very hard, clear reality. When you go to work, and this is true for a wage earner, it's basically true for a salary earner as well. When you go to work, you basically give up your normal everyday freedoms. That is, when you walk into your workplace, factory, office, store, whatever it is, when you begin work, when you're on the clock, as we say, your behavior, where you sit or stand, how you sit or stand, what you're to do, how you're to do it, when you're to do it, every dimension of your life over the period of, say, 8 hours that you work, you, in a literal sense, become somebody else's slave. You're working for them. Everything you produce belongs to them in the instant that you produce it, whether it's a good or a service. It is a kind of slavery. True, it's not perpetual in the way that a slave once was. It's time limited. It's those 8 hours for the day that you are employed by that employer. But during that time, the work hours, you are very close to what a slave is on a continuing basis. And I think that's the reason why it struck people very much like a commonsensical idea. And the last point I'd make is when the tide turned after the end of the Great Depression, during which time Groucho made those movies, with that over, the business community in America, the government that they control, went to work not just to get rid of communists and to deport aliens and all the other things they did, but also to consciousness so that the commonsensical ideas were not the kind that had matured in the decades before the 1950s, but could be rearranged so people wouldn't make the connection between wage labor on the one hand and enslavement on the other.
First of all, I knew, Richard Wolff, you wouldn't disappoint me in interpreting this, number one. And number two, I guess some thoughts on what happened since the FDR era. So it seems to me that one of the concessions made then by business owners and those who had accumulated wealth in order to keep the whole enterprise in the national sense going was that they would accept a certain amount of labor activity, organizational labor, that they would accept union formation and so on, and that in certain cases, particularly perhaps during and after the World War II era, even some collaboration between the organized labor and organized business and so on, a Chamber of Commerce and so on, that there was some sort of truce between them. But it's this a second pop culture reference, film reference, but I think maybe germane also. I did some reading. I saw the film The Irishman, the Martin Scorsese film, and one of the major characters in it is Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa, the famous Teamsters leader, was cross-examined by Bobby Kennedy when Kennedy was working for, I guess when he was working for Joe McCarthy in the Senate. It seems to me that one of the things that happened in the post-war sort of cultural and messaging shift against working people and against labor was to pick out what might have been, some isolated examples of a powerful, but I would argue somewhat isolated figures like Jimmy Hoffa, emphasize their corruptness, turn attention away from ethical unions and union leaders. And it seems to me by the late 60s, early 70s, most people were of the opinion that unions, by their very nature, and certainly American unions, were corrupt. And it seemed like that was the first strike against organized labor post-war. But how's my history on that?
No, you're absolutely right. And the two issues, the Groucho Marx clip and your point now, are intimately connected. It was important to change the popular conception of what a union is. Let's remember, during the 1930s, we had the greatest unionizing drive in the history of the United States. We had never seen anything like it before, and we have never seen anything like it since. In the depths of a depression, millions of American people who had never been in a union, whose parents been in the union, decided that the safest way to get through the Great Depression of the 1930s was to join a union. You would be safer, you would be better protected, you would have a better chance of getting through it if you were connected to other working people like yourself in an active union. And unions became part of the culture. Unions became organizations of millions of people. And so unionization had to be legalized by Roosevelt, because if he hadn't, he would have forced the unions into a more revolutionary position than they ultimately occupied. He was smart enough as president to see that he could co-opt them, at least to a certain extent, only if he gave them something in return. And I think, to go back to the Groucho Marx, it was very important to stop the notion that a wage earner is a slave, and therefore that the employer is a master in the sense of the person who enslaves you. Notice how we changed. And in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the employer became a commonsensical, and here the phrase is so revealing, a job creator. Oh my goodness, what a wonderful change of designation, of label, of name. And those things are not inconsequential. You now look on an employer almost as though he gave you a gift. He is a job creator. He gives you a job, as if he's giving you something beneficial, which is a radically different image than the man who enslaves you into wage labor. And I think the people who made these shifts of language understood that that was as important in redirecting American society so that it was business friendly rather than business critical, that it was as important to do that as it was to hobble the unions with the Taft-Hartley bill in 1947, as well as the depiction of them. If you remember that old movie On the Waterfront, where you literally taught people that the union is a corruption, et cetera, et cetera. If you go back 10, 15 years earlier, the typical Hollywood movie portrayed the businessman as the corrupt person, the one conniving to throw the family out of the house, couldn't pay the mortgage on anymore, the evil banker who's conniving with local businesses to screw you out of your land or to exploit your children, et cetera, et cetera. It is, the culture war is always going on and is always intimately intertwined with the economic conflicts that capitalism can never escape.
So first I want to run by you my saying about job creators, which is that, you tell me if I'm right or wrong, I always say bosses aren't job creators, workers are boss creators. And that, in fact, that's an inversion of what should be. If working people weren't producing that surplus value that becomes profit, bosses, and of course you've devoted much of your work to not giving workers opportunity not to let go of that value, but that surplus value that workers create for the bosses is what creates a class of capitalists, investors, executives, and so on. They live off that. Is my formulation correct?
Absolutely. And let me put it the same point in another way. The employer doesn't create the job. If you've ever worked with an employer, as I have many times in my life, the honest ones and even the dishonest ones will tell you that they can only hire workers on one basic condition: if they can sell what those workers help to produce. In other words, it's not a decision the employer makes. The employer wants you to understand his hands are tied. Only if the mass of working people have the resources with which to buy the commodities that come off the production line will the employer hire people to make those commodities. So the irony is the job is created for the worker by the worker in his capacity as a consumer. If the worker as consumer has the income from his job that suffices to buy goods and services, it's that purchase of goods and services that alone enables the employer to give a job. So if you really want to look to where it all starts, it starts with the worker who is not only the producer of the product, but is the goal for production because he's the consumer of the product in the vast majority of cases.
And again, we're talking with Professor Richard Wolff, economist and host of Economic Update. And so going back to the culture war around all this, the communications war around all this. So fast forward to the 1980s, unions have been demonized. Ronald Reagan is president. Even Bob Dylan sings a song in the 80s called Union Sundown. It was a great idea until greed got in the way. We've demonized organized labor to a certain extent. Bill Clinton comes in, takes over the Democratic Party with the Democratic Leadership Council. They're basically, they treat organized labor, their stalwart supporter, as kind of the embarrassing uncle they'd rather hide in the attic, and so on. Then we have this sort of, as you pointed out, this sort of elevation of the boss as the figure of common sense wisdom, as the generous dispenser of jobs. Then it goes a step further, I would argue. In the 1990s, mid-1990s, Oliver Stone makes a movie called Wall Street, and the villain in that movie, who Stone in interviews very clear was meant to be a despicable villain, Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas, says his famous line, "Greed is good." And much to Oliver Stone's amazement, not to those of us maybe who've known people that work on Wall Street, but to Stone's amazement, Gordon Gekko becomes a hero to an entire generation of investment bankers, would-be investment bankers, and so on, and fortifies a culture. Since we've had other movies talking about it, this is the culture that brought on, of course, the financial crisis of 2008, the risk-taking, dishonest, the inflation, and maybe they're not as beloved as they once were, but we still have, it seems to me, as a culture, have something of a fetish around extravagantly wealthy individuals, billionaires with yachts and private planes and so on. Unlike, and this will be my last pop culture reference for the moment, unlike, for example, when Little Orphan Annie in the original strip gets stuck with a evil financier, it's Daddy Warbucks, whose name means Warbucks, defense contractor. All of these guys, whether they're defense contractors living off violence and government contracts, whether it's Wall Street, somehow it seems that the old notion that they were greedy and destructive forces, especially when they come to accumulate many billions, it's coming back, I think. But it seems to me it was asleep for decades, and now maybe it's starting to come back. But what are your thoughts on all of that?
I agree. I think they're coming back, and it's coming back in a rush, and it is terrifying the people at the top because, and I know this sounds extreme, but it's what I believe, it's what I think I see. I don't think capitalists have the capacity as a group to learn from their history. I mean, and then as the saying goes, if you don't learn from it, you're going to be condemned to repeat it. They didn't learn that if you unleash the capitalist system without all kinds of limits and constraints and regulations and countervailing powers in the working class, it is going to blow itself out of the water. That's what it did in the decades leading up to the great crash of 1929. And since they didn't learn the real lessons, that's what happened in the decades leading up to 2008. And now that we've had 10 years, which will be looked back on as the lost 10 years, 2008 to 2018, to see that the economy has taken over a decade even to get back to where it was, leaving millions of Americans behind even where they were 10 years ago, you're going to get the predictable, with extreme inequality, with this kind of instability, with the unfair, unequal recoveries, people at the top who brought the crisis, getting the bailouts to get them through, the people who are not responsible for the crisis being left behind. This is going to slowly but steadily accumulate the kinds of anger and bitterness that you can see all around. I mean, let me give you an example from today. You know, on the 5th of December, 2019, the country of France entered into an open-ended general strike. The labor unions, who are stronger there than they are in the United States, the Yellow Vest movement, a vast popular movement committed to ending the inequality of France, which, by the way, is both bad but not as bad as it is here in the United States. You're seeing movements, granted it's France, where there's a long history of this kind of behavior, but sooner or later, what they're doing in France will percolate over here. That's what Occupy showed. That's what Bernie and the resurgence of a socialist alternative political movement shows. It's all coming, and I think the shifting notion of the employer class as not the heroes, you know, and it wasn't just today. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, you know, I remember Lee Iacocca, I believe he was the head of the Ford Motor Company or something. Suddenly these kinds of CEOs had books written about them. They were the great heroes, as if these corporations were not successful because of the 200,000 workers working in them, but because of the lone character in the big office at the top who somehow gathered around himself the laurels of what a lot of other people had created. And that led into this glorification of the Bezos or the Gates or any of these other people who, if you actually know and talk to them, are often the first ones to admit that they couldn't have done 3/4 of what was achieved without dozens of specialists and trained professionals and on-the-line workers who figured this little detail out or figured that improvement which ramified through the business. I mean, the notion that this is all the work of the executive at the top is really the same kind of mistake as to think that what's important about, say, medieval Germany was some potentate who sat on the top of a throne and who probably didn't know 3/4 of what was going on in the society, let alone be responsible for it.
And again, we're talking with Professor Richard Wolff. I think about in terms of that sort of stage in history, recent history, where CEOs became folk heroes. I was thinking about the idealization, I guess it was in the late 80s, of Jack Welch, who notoriously, in my words, notoriously would take companies over, fire huge thousands of employees, and then he was, I think he was the first guy, certainly the first guy I knew about, who basically did the venture capital, vulture capital, come in, take it over, slash, turn it, suck the profits out and value out of it, take it away and leave an empty shell in its place. And he became a folk hero, and they called him, I remember you'll remember this too, they called him Neutron Jack. And he wrote a book with that name, and people sort of glorified him with that name, not thinking about the fact, in a way he was a perfect hero for the time to me, because a neutron bomb is a weapon of mass murder that kills human beings by the tens of thousands, but leaves property intact. That's the characteristic. So I get why certain people would idealize the neutron bomb as a sort of ultimate capitalist weapon, if you will. But the amazing thing to me was the extent to which mass media and then the culture as a whole would take a predator like Jack Welch, is my view, that's what he was or is, and turn him into a hero, the sort of real life, moral equivalent of Gordon Gekko. So it's changing, as you said, it's changing. I guess my question for you is it changing fast enough to avert disaster?
I think so. I think, first of all, I would make the point that it was an explicit objective to change these images. In other words, go back to the end of World War II and the McCarthy period and the witch hunts against socialists and communists. What you did there was by changing the socialist and communist from the image he and she had in the 1930s and 40s, the militant, the first one to go out on strike, the person who organized his or her fellow workers, who brought them into the union. These were the people at the front lines, the people who had the courage, the people who had the dedication, the people who were celebrated in songs by Woody Guthrie or in the novels of Steinbeck, etc., etc. These people were suddenly redefined. They were the socialists and communists who were, quote unquote, disloyal, who were selling out the United States to the Soviet Union. They were evil, they were nefarious, they led 3 lives, all of the rest of that elaborate program of demonization of them. That was the way you then changed people's attitudes. You were taking away their heroes. And as anyone who's ever done this before, or who's ever worked in advertising knows, one of the ways you can get people to leave one set of heroes requires you to give them another set. So instead of the militant worker celebrated by socialists and communists, you had to have the idealized employer who is in some way realizing the American dream by stepping on everybody around him to become richer than Croesus in order to show, see, I'm the hero, I'm the winner, I'm what you should model. By the way, as an economics professor, living through all of this, my colleagues and I, my right-wing colleagues, my left-wing colleagues, and those in the middle, we all watched as graduate students and undergraduates changed from what they were in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. Namely, they took economics courses to understand how the economy works. Then into the later 70s, 80s, 90s, and the early part of this century, our students weren't interested in understanding how the economy works. They were interested in making money. They wanted the economics courses to give them clues, hints, strategies, tactics, to become Gordon Gekko or something like that. It was a new definition of what success meant, what the goals of a young person, even in the university, ought to be. And you can see all of that breaking down now in the aftermath of 2008. Because in the iconography, in the hero worship of the business, implicit in that was a fundamental mistake about understanding capitalism. The mistake was it's a system that only goes up. It's a system of prosperity, of progress, of development, of improvement, and there's no room in that story for collapse. They should have known, they should have remembered the history of 1920s and 1929 in particular, but they didn't. That's what I mean. They don't seem to learn anything. Gung-ho they were, and then when everything collapsed, first in 2000 with the dot-com fiasco, but even more in 2008 with the general collapse that was global, suddenly everybody realized, some more, some less, that they had been sold a bill of goods, that this capitalism wasn't a one-way street for everybody rising. It wasn't the tide that lifted all boats. It wasn't endless prosperity. You could get wiped out in a month, as many did. You could lose your job, as millions did. You could lose your home, as millions did. And it could take you a decade that you would never recover if your education was interrupted, if your home life was destroyed, if your marriage fell apart, all of which happened to millions of people. This is a profound shock. And what you're seeing in everything from movies to novels to the rise of the Occupy movement to the phenomena of Bernie, of AOC, of even in a small way, people like me suddenly having an internet audience that people like me didn't used to have because the wind is changing. You know, I might mention to you at the beginning, the middle actually, of November I did a debate. There's a society called IQ Squared. Your viewers and listeners might be interested. They hold debates, I believe, on a monthly basis. And so they invited me to one, which took place in New York City at a unit of the City University called Hunter College, pretty well known. And they had, I don't know, 500 or 600 people in there, and there was a debate over the following proposition. Capitalism is a blessing. That was the proposition. 2 people spoke in favor of it, and 2 people spoke against it. Speaking in favor was John Mackey, the CEO of the Whole Foods Corporation, which has recently become part of Amazon, and a woman whose name escapes me, who's the editor of Reason magazine. They were in favor. They think capitalism is a blessing. On the other side was Bhaskar Sunkara, the editor of Jacobin magazine, and myself. And we debated. Our position was capitalism is not a blessing. It is whatever the opposite of blessing is. That's what it is.
Curse, I believe. Yeah.
Maybe a curse. And here's the interesting thing. In a relatively random collection, by the way, this IQ Squared is a conservative-leaning entity. It's funded by a very wealthy businessman. It usually tilts in that direction. So this was a bit of a departure for them. To their credit, they were open to doing that. I think that's already a sign of something shifting. I don't think 5 years ago we would have had such a situation. That proposition that capitalism is a blessing would have simply been assumed as common sense, but now it was an object of debate. And we used in this debate, that's their decision, not mine, the Oxford University of England debating rules. And the basic idea here is when the audience comes in at the beginning, before the debate, they rank what their position is on the proposition capitalism is a blessing. Then at the end of the debate, when all the arguments have been made, they do it again. And the winner is whoever gains support by virtue of the debate, so that the audience, on average, is more favorable than they were before. So it isn't a question of what people think, it's a question of how much their thinking was affected by the debate. And to the amazement of everyone, we won. That is, the critics, the people who don't think capitalism is a blessing, in this random collection of whatever it was, 500 or 600 people gathered in the Danny Kaye Auditorium of Hunter College in Manhattan, they voted basically against capitalism and for socialism. I don't think that's conceivable 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago in the United States, anywhere. And it is one small sign of the shift of opinion that keeps growing. Look at the difficulty the media had. They went after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with vengeance the minute she was elected. And she outwits the media, not because she's all that good at it. She couldn't be. She's a novice at all of this. She was a bartender before she won that election. But she is somehow in the spirit of the times. I don't mean to take anything away from her. She has mastered media communications in a very hostile environment extraordinarily well. And I think it is no disrespect to her to say she, like me, like Bernie, like lots of others, are riding a shift. As to whether it'll happen far enough, short enough, I don't know. But the biggest recruiter for a critique of capitalism right now, the 2 biggest recruiters are, number one, the inability of this capitalist system to serve the mass of people who feel that they are falling ever further behind, and number 2, Donald Trump.
On that note, Professor Richard Wolff, as always, a great pleasure talking to you. As always, thank you for all the insights, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
My pleasure, and I look forward to talking with you, Richard, again soon.